Hi, Greg.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show on meaningoflife.tv. You're Greg Hickok. You're a professor of cognitive sciences at UC Irvine. You're also author of a book called The Myth of Mirror Neurons. And we're going to talk about mirror neurons today and whether they are quite as magical as some people had thought of them as being. They've been implicated in, human empathy and certainly in the popular press. You're skeptical. We're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about a kind of paradigm called embodied cognition, which I've never been able to get clear on the meaning of. You're going to help me understand it, but also you have a fascinating idea about some connections between that perspective and physics. You think looking at some pretty arcane and theoretical parts of physics can help test the plausibility of a certain version of embodied cognition called radical embodied cognition.
That's right. I'll do my best to clarify all those things.
So that's our mission today. Now, on mirror neurons. Now, first of all, I guess your book's been out about a year, and I'm wondering if you have the sense that you have carried the day. I mean, what is the kind of academic? Is there an academic consensus on the argument you're making? I mean, have the original researchers, this research group in Italy, have they conceded the argument or what?
No, not at all. They're sticking to their guns on their theoretical position. I don't expect them to change their views. Oftentimes all of us get stuck in our own ways of thinking about stuff, and that's okay. It's useful to push ideas as far as they'll go. The response that I've seen, at least to my face, is that the arguments that I laid out in the book have been fairly convincing and have changed the way a lot of people thought about what mirror neurons are doing.
Okay.
That's my sense. It's had an impact on the way a lot of people think.
Okay, so let's talk about the idea of mirror neurons and also distinguish between the kind of popular presentation of what they might be able to do and the original kind of professional presentation by these researchers in Italy. I gather the idea was that in monkeys or some non-human primate species, they noticed that some of the neurons that are active when the monkeys did certain things like grasp for a cup or something were also active when the monkeys saw some other monkey or some other human or something do the same thing, right? That's the finding.
That is the basic mirror neuron result that led to all this theorizing.
And does that remain uncontested by you? I mean, that actually happens?
Yes, that actually happens. Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
And then what was the interpretation of the research group in Italy?
So the interpretation that ended up developing into all these ideas is that the motor response was involved, that is the cells firing when the animal is reaching for something, is controlling a motor behavior. But the sensory response, the response when the monkey was watching someone else do it, was reflecting the monkey's understanding of that action. So basically the idea is this, that when I reach for a cup, I know my intentions, I know the goal of that reaching action. And therefore, if I want to understand what you're doing when you're reaching for a cup, what I can do is to simulate that same movement in my motor system. And since I understand my own movements, and since I'm simulating yours, I can automatically understand your intentions when you're reaching. That's the basic
And there's
idea.
a certain kind of appeal to that. I mean, you expect evolution to work economically when possible and work with the materials at hand. And if you already had these neurons like governing your own gesture, and then the animal evolves to a stage where it starts interpreting similar actions by others, you might imagine in a vague way that you've already got this mechanism there. Evolution would pick up on that, right? So it's not a crazy idea.
It's not a crazy idea. It's one that's surfaced multiple times in the history of psychology and neuroscience. It was a big idea back at the turn of the 20th century in the early 1900s, when people were talking about motor theories of all sorts of things. Kind of died off and then reemerged in the 1950s with something called the motor theory of speech perception, which is the idea that the way we perceive speech sounds is not recovering the acoustic information that's in those sounds, but recovering the motor gestures that generated them. And this came out of work by Al Lieberman at Haskins' lab. And that was a serious hypothesis that was investigated for several decades, eventually proved wrong in the speech world, but then kind of paradoxically, served as the basis for the interpretation of mirror neurons in some ways.
So then the research is in Italy. And what was the name of the lead researcher there?
Giacomo Rizzolatti.
Okay. So he actually invoked that literature, perhaps not aware that among specialists in that field it had been discredited, that this theory of speech comprehension or perception had been discredited?
Yeah, I'm not sure if he was aware that it was discredited or not, but certainly in the first two papers, empirical papers on mirror neurons, they mention this theory and Lieberman's work. And notice the similarity between the motor theory of speech perception and the response properties of mirror neurons. So absolutely.
Okay. So then the way this got filtered through the popular press, I mean, I heard a couple of versions, and you tell me which ones, if any, were actually intended by the researchers themselves. I mean, it came to be associated with empathy. And there's kind of two kinds of empathy. There's just perspective taking, just putting yourself in the shoes of the other person and like imagining like, okay, what they're thinking, what their perceptions are. There's that kind of empathy. And that seems to me more analogous with the interpretation you've already described than the other kind of empathy, which is emotional empathy, which is like feeling their pain, feeling the feeling they feel. I think in the popular press, the idea came to be that mirror neurons could do all of this, if not more. How much of that was suggested by the researchers?
The empathy story was promoted by one of the original collaborators.
It was.
Yes, it was. So
and did they distinguish between cognitive empathy and kind of emotional empathy?
I'm not sure if they did. The mechanism that they believe holds for mirror neurons is a very automatic kind of non-cognitive resonance of the sensory information with this motor response. And so if I had to speak for them, I would think that they would consider the mirror neuron version of a theory of empathy would be this much more automatic, feel your pain automatically kind of response. But there were the mirror neuron theory of action understanding, that is understanding what the gestures that I'm generating or reaching actions that I'm generating mean, was the first bit in the monkey interpreting the monkey mirror neurons. But that was quickly generalized to humans in a couple of domains. One was speech, which was part of this explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole language story was quickly built up as a generalization of the mirror neuron story. Empathy was another, and theory of mind was yet another. That is this idea that we understand that we have a mind of our own and control our own actions, and you have a different mind that is responsible for controlling your actions. And basically, it was the same mechanism for all these things. If I can simulate your situation, whatever that is, in my mind, I can put myself in your shoes and through that mechanism understand what you're thinking, what you're doing, and so on.
Now, by the way, wasn't there already a separate body of work in brain imaging that had identified parts of the brain associated with kind of theory of mind type things, like imagining like what the other person is thinking? And
yes, there is a whole industry of research on theory of mind and ideas about it being a mental module of sorts that has its own brain substrate. Mm-hmm. And so some of the mirror neuron theories with respect to theory of mind were kind of a reaction to that approach, yes.
And it was was it an alternative to it, or just?
It was an alternative because the standard theory was that there was this special module that had to develop and evolve. And it was a separate thing, like language. The standard theory of language is that it was a separate theory, a separate domain of cognition or ability that evolved separate from other aspects of cognition that enabled speech and language. The mirror neuron perspective promised to integrate all of these things, saying, look, there's this one very basic mechanism that we see the roots of in non-human primates. And if we scale it up, we can explain language and empathy and theory of mind and autism and all sorts of things like that. And so it's actually very exciting theory and very much worth serious investigation.
So the idea was that when a monkey sees another monkey like reach for a stick and is kind of starting to think, okay, reaching for a stick, could do various things with a stick, whatever the monkey is kind of thinking or comprehending, that integrally involved in that perception and comprehension are the very neurons that would govern that monkey's doing the same thing.
Exactly right.
And what set of findings or observations led you to be skeptical of that interpretation?
Well, since I came out of the speech domain, the speech world, that's my basic research is speech language neuroscience. And I was well aware of the fact that the motor theory was an interesting theory that had been discredited. And I was also well aware of plenty of clinical syndromes in which patients lose the ability to produce speech and yet retain the ability to comprehend speech and perceive speech. So this is a very common type of aphasia syndrome called Broca's aphasia. Everyone who's studied a little bit of language and brain knows about this syndrome and knows that it's defined by this very condition that violates the theoretical prediction of mirror neurons. So my perspective when I first heard about mirror neurons is, well, that's interesting, and maybe it applies to monkeys interpreting the actions of others. It doesn't apply to language. It just doesn't apply. And so, all this speculation about language isn't going to work out. And I kind of ignored it for several years. But then the speech work started getting closer and closer to my own research, which is part of it is speech motor control and sensory motor interactions, and we were starting to overlap. So I had to look at it seriously. And then when I went back and looked at the original results in monkeys and in non-language domains, I realized that there were all sorts of holes in the arguments. And so that's kind of what led to this reaction of mine.
Okay. And if you do think that the original finding is a real finding, there is the correlation between what these monkeys are watching and what their neurons are doing. What is your interpretation? What do you think is going on?
Yeah, so you have to back up a few years before mirror neurons were discovered to get an intuitive sense of how the response of these cells might be interpreted. Mm-hmm. So before mirror neurons were discovered, the Parma lab, Rizzolatti and his colleagues, were studying motor control. They were studying grasping, and they were looking at populations of cells in motor cortex that responded while monkeys were reaching for different objects. And what they found was something really fascinating. They found that there were different cells that were tuned to different grip types or grasping types. So you might find a cell that liked this kind of grasp, another cell that preferred this kind of grasp. And so you had like this collection of neurons that were coding for a vocabulary of grasps. And then these same cells would respond when the experimenter simply showed objects of different size and shape.
Showed the thing that they would grasp?
Exactly. So just to use an example, I have a mug here. They might find a cell that responded to a whole hand grasp like that when the monkey was reaching. And then they showed the monkey something that was graspable with that grasp, and that same cell would respond to the observation.
Well, why didn't the monkey go ahead and grasp it? I mean, it makes sense that the neuron would fire because presumably the monkey is preparing to grasp it. I mean, did they put it in a place where the monkey couldn't actually do the grasping?
Yeah, so that was actually what they were trying to separate when they discovered mirror neurons. So basically, you can find these cells that when you present an appropriately sized object, so a large object, it will fire to a large object and a large object type grasp, and also, but wouldn't respond to a small object and a small object type grasp. So they wondered whether these were really sensory responses when they showed the object, because usually in these experiments they'll present an object, but the monkey isn't allowed to reach right away. There's a delay, and the monkey doesn't get a reward if it reaches right away. So it has to wait until a cue happens, and then the monkey will reach. So they can. And
yet the neurons start moving even before it's allowed to reach.
Yeah, exactly. And there were experiments where they presented the object, and then they wondered whether it was just a visual response and not a motor response. And so they did the reaching behavior in the dark, and did all these controls to really show that this network has both a sensory response. You present an appropriate object. It'll respond to that alone, even if there's no grasping or even if there's no motor act, as well as during the actual act. Mm-hmm. So this was they were trying to set up an experiment to try to separate out these two phases of the task. When they discovered, as they were swapping out objects in the box that the monkey was reaching into, they would reach in and grab an object to pull it out, to prepare for the next trial, put a new object in, and so on. And since they were always recording from these cells and had a loudspeaker playing the neuron's response, they heard cells that started responding to the experimenters reaching and grasping and doing things like that. And that's how these things were discovered.
So originally it wasn't other monkeys they were watching, it was humans.
Oh, it was always humans.
It was always humans. So okay. So so human reaches in and grasps a mug, and the neurons that normally govern or are involved in the monkey's grasping of a mug fire.
Right. Yeah. So the interpretation of that result is a very interesting one. Basically, the idea is that you have a population of neurons in motor cortex that code for a vocabulary of grasp types, and that this vocabulary of grasp types can be excited or activated or selected by an appropriate object. So you have a sensory bit of information, a cup or a pen or whatever, that is presented to the organism that excites the corresponding motor plans, and those plans are selected, and then the grasping actually happens. So the sensory response isn't a response of understanding what the thing is, that is to say whether it's a cup or a pen. Mm-hmm. It's a response that is involved in selecting the appropriate response to that object, independent of what it is in particular. All that matters is its shape and size and orientation and so on. So that was the Parma group's interpretation of this other class of neurons that are now called canonical neurons. So when they first discovered mirror neurons, the first impulse in interpretation, and in fact you see a description of this theory in the first paragraph of the discussion of the first mirror neuron paper that they published. The first theoretical impulse in interpretation is that these cells are involved in selecting actions appropriate to responding to other animals' actions, which makes a lot of sense. If I stuck my hand out to shake your hand, that's an action that is associated with an appropriate response, in this case a mirror response, in you if you were going to shake
and that happens, in that case it so happens that there's a symmetry in what you're doing is exactly what I'm going to do in response. And so you know, but of course you can imagine, like, if you throw something at me and I run, there's not the symmetry and you might not see the same thing.
There's not a symmetry, that's exactly right. But there is a relation between seeing things that you do and appropriate responses on my side. So just like different objects should elicit different action types on my part, seeing different actions, maybe an aggressive or a friendly action, should elicit different types of action responses on my part. So the same need is essentially in place for having a system that takes action information and relating it to motor plans for responses to those actions. Okay. So that generally is a possibility. That was ultimately rejected. That idea was ultimately rejected for a couple of reasons. One is
by the researchers.
By the researchers,
not
yes.
By you, as it will.
That's right. They considered this hypothesis and ultimately rejected it for a few reasons. But intuitively, you can. The main one is this symmetry of response didn't make much sense, like you were suggesting. Like, it would make sense if I, put my hand out with something in it and you grasped it and did something kind of opposite to what I was doing. But the symmetry was odd, particularly because macaques, which is the species they were studying, don't show this kind of imitation, overt symmetrical imitation like humans do. Mm-hmm. Humans tend to imitate each other more often than macaques do. And so they reasoned that, well, since there's no behavior that these cells could possibly be supporting that we see in the monkeys, it can't be an action selection story. It has to be something about action understanding. So that's why they rejected it. But in fact, if you look at the distribution of mirror neuron types, the number of cells that show just the right property for understanding actions and mirroring them in a very symmetrical way is much lower than the number of cells that you find that show a more broad kind of tuning, including cells that responded on the motor side when the monkey was reaching, and on the sensory observational side to an action when the experimenter was placing. Exactly this kind of opposite, you do this, I do that, kind of response, which is much more consistent with the view that these cells are just being tuned to respond appropriately for action selection based on the actions they see. So that's my interpretation of what mirror neurons are doing. It's just like the rest of that system. It is taking sensory input, in this case actions, and using that input to activate an appropriate motor response.
So mirror neurons are an example of neurons doing what you would expect neurons to do, which is to say, when they see some kind of action in the world, including an action by another organism, preparing the body to respond appropriately. It's just that in some cases, it so happens that what they observe another organism doing is kind of like what the appropriate response is, right?
That's right.
So handshaking is a good example in that sense. It's going to so happen that I see you stick out your hand, and the neurons governing my own sticking out of my hand fire, but that's just because the appropriate reaction to your doing that is my doing the same thing, and it's kind of a coincidence.
That's right. And so you might wonder why there were so many cells that had this mirror-like response. It wasn't a huge number of cells. There were 12 in the original study in 1992, a few more in the next one, where they sampled more neurons. But if you look carefully in other papers, if you read the whole set of studies that these investigators have done, you get clues to the training that these monkeys actually underwent. And some of the training involved the experimenters taking a kind of tray and grasping an object, putting it down, handing it to the monkey. So the monkey had a lot of exposure to these experimenters grasping things, handing them things, and so you can imagine how these cells might get tuned up to respond.
And that had typically preceded the monkey's opportunity to do grasping itself.
Absolutely, yes.
And that's why there was that conditioned reaction.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so how do you account for the reaction to the idea of mirror neurons and how rapidly it spread through popular culture and the interpretation it got? And I gather it did get, to some extent, a more romantic kind of interpretation in popular culture than maybe even the original researchers had given it.
Yeah, it grew to basically explain all of our ability to be human, our appreciation for sports, culture. Some people famously called it, the Big Bang of human evolution kind of thing that really enabled us to be human. So yeah, it got kind of out of control. But you can see how it would build up from the basic assumption. If you have a mechanism, a very simple mechanism that you can find in monkeys that simulates what other monkeys are doing, and from there, in terms of actions, from there, if you can get to language, which you can think of as a kind of action, I'm generating moving my mouth to generate something, and you can simulate what I'm doing, and so on. And then if you'd make the jump there to emotions, you're simulating my emotions, and then you get empathy, and then you put all those things together. Theory of mind. My theory of mind is just a simulation of your mental state. So you're kind of generalizing the idea, and then you've gotten everything that's pretty much thought to be unique to humans. You've got language, you've got culture, you've got all these things. You can explain autism as a breakdown of these things, which is probably incorrect on a couple levels. And so it's quite easy once you make that first assumption to build an interesting story, assuming that first assumption is correct. And what I've tried to show is that first assumption is not correct based on looking at the mirror neuron data in monkeys itself, as well as looking at what happens in humans who have damage to the proposed mirror neuron system, where they have the motor problems, but they don't have the understanding or perceptual problems.
It is one of those things that would be interesting if true. I think there's also, it was associated largely with positive things like empathy. That's a good thing in most people's minds. And I think there is something I've observed, which is that people like to believe that good things are rooted in our biology. And what's kind of funny in this case to me is that with empathy, that was already obviously true. I mean, empathy exists in all human cultures and is deployed under predictable circumstances, and there's whole evolutionary ideas about the plausible ideas about the evolution of it. It's like I don't see how anyone could doubt that empathy is a biological reaction, and yet I've noticed that in general, there's something. It's kind of like the brain imaging. It's kind of like the romanticism of brain imaging studies in general. It's like they found that there's a place in the brain correlated with anger. Well, I would have assumed so, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I think the way I've thought about that kind of thinking, or that line of thinking, is that not so much in terms of the brain areas or whatever that respond to that, but a favorite mechanism for these kinds of approaches is this simulation mechanism, and it's used as an explanation. And I can go back and answer your previous question in a little more detail. Why were people so excited about mirror neurons? And I'll answer both those questions in one. So basically, you had these very complicated domains like language and theory of mind and all this stuff that had built up a large literature and a lot of cognitive baggage. It takes a lot of cognitive computational work to explain language, for example. It's a complicated system. Mirror neurons offered a really simple explanation. All you do is you simulate it. And here's a mirror neuron that seems to do simulation automatically. It just resonates. It's like a tuning fork. It just resonates. Nothing complicated. No math involved. And that was very appealing to people who were studying these things. Plus, it had a neurophysiological basis that seemed, like legitimate. Here's some legitimate science that we see in non-human primates. And it potentially provides us with an evolutionary explanation, which we don't really have for language necessarily. So it was just like a trifecta of the kind of things that exactly what we're looking for in terms of simplifying explanations, unifying ideas. But the simulation mechanism is kind of a smokescreen. So you say that we understand language or whatever by simulation. It doesn't really explain anything. You basically substituted a new term, simulation, and used it to explain a whole process, but you haven't really explained anything. And the example that I use in my book is, suppose there's a rogue head of state that wants to figure out how to build a nuclear weapon. He gets his physicist in and says, tell me how to do it. And they go off for a couple of weeks and come back and say, yeah, we figured it out. All we have to do is simulate what Oppenheimer and his team did. And the rogue head of state says, yeah, great. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, we don't know, but we know that simulation will work. So just to say that something is simulated or that some brain area activates, to use your example, or is correlated, it doesn't explain what's happening. And that's been the big gap in a lot of this work, which is true of embodied cognition as well.
Okay. Well, I have to admit that somewhere in a book of mine is a reference to mirror neurons that I would take out if I could. But what happened was this is a book published in 2009. I was writing about perspective taking, which I was kind of calling moral imagination, because I was talking about cases where you're taking the perspective of someone in a very different circumstance from yours. My editor wrote in, couldn't this be related to mirror neurons? In the draft. And I thought, I'll put in a parenthetical saying this could be related to mirror neurons, and so it's still there, I'm afraid. And who knows? I mean, I guess even by your own account, the story isn't completely closed. More data will come in, but you seem pretty confident that your interpretation is right for now.
Yeah, the evidence is pretty compelling, and it's true. It's gotten all over. It's kind of fun to every so often I'll go on Google and just Google mirror neurons and then click news. And invariably, there is, something that comes up that has been attributed to mirror neurons. The last time I checked, Hillary Clinton didn't have any, according to some news outlet. It's crazy. It's all over the place.
So the popular culture, you don't see signs of it catching up with what is, by your account, becoming a consensus in academia?
Popular culture is still stuck on the idea that mirror neurons are doing something, just like it's still stuck on the idea that we only use 10% of our brains and that the left and the right hemispheres are doing radically different things and all these sorts of myths.
Don't you think they're doing somewhat different things, the left and the right?
Yeah, they are, but they're more similar than different. So again, this is the same kind of thing that phrenology is another example, where you have some basic scientific result that has some scientific legitimacy. Mirror neurons do exist. They do have the response properties they do. The left and the right hemispheres do respond differently. You sever the connections and you can find differences, absolutely. But then that gets exaggerated tremendously.
Sure, like there's the artistic side,
Yeah,
and there's the analytical side. Yeah. I mean, the other thing is the famous experiments were not done on anatomically normal brains. I mean, they were illuminating, but most of us don't have our corpus callosum severed. The two hemispheres are connected, so those were not normal brains at work.
Right. Yeah. There's obviously complications there.
Yeah. I mean, of course, that's the reason they could do the experiment, was the fact that, so I can't blame them. I mean, they were illuminating. Okay, so let's get into this embodied cognition thing. You had a really interesting blog post about how if a particularly weird prospect posed by quantum physics is true, then that would bode ill for something called radical embodied cognition. Now, first of all, I've tried to get people to explain to me what embodied cognition is, and I just don't get it.
Yes.
What is the idea of embodied cognition?
Okay, so let's back up a little bit in the history of psychology just to put it in context. So up before the 1950s, 1960s, the dominant view of the mind in psychology, at least American psychology, was behaviorism. Basically, you had sensory information and you had behavior, and all psychology was patterns of association between those. So talk of anything in the mind was just taboo.
Right. So strictly speaking, it wasn't a view of the mind. It was a view that psychologists should not speak about the mind because it's not observable the way scientific data should be.
Right. Yeah. So the topic of psychology is just input and output, essentially. Right. So cognitive psychology, or the cognitive revolution, as it's often called, I think, unfortunately, because cognitive implies the colloquial term of referring to language and complicated things, but cognitive psychologists view sensory perception as part of that revolution. In any case, so the reaction was that you can't explain behavior simply in terms of input and output contingencies. You have to talk about information processing, which would have been a better name for the revolution. And what came out of that, so around the same time, digital computers were being developed, and it made it easy for investigators to think about how you might process information. And digital computers do it symbolically with some fancy math over computate the hardware that exists in computers. And so it was used as kind of an analogy. And theorizing about language and other mental abilities got very abstract in terms of symbol representations and things like that. Embodied cognition is kind of a reaction to that abstractness of the process of the mind. And so what they're interested in doing is pushing the complexity of cognition back out into grounded kind of representations. And by grounded, there's various views of embodied cognition. A standard one concerns, for example, conceptual representation. So you think about your knowledge, your concept of a cup. Standard cognitive theories will say that that's a very abstract representation that counts any orientation of a particular cup, any shading, any type of cup, all different cups of different sizes and shapes and colors will count as an example of a cup, which is in your mind, according to these theories, an abstract representation. What the embodied cognition folks started saying is, well, your concept isn't simply abstract and divorced from what we sense and interact with, that part of your concept of a cup is your experience, your visual experience with actual cups, your tactile experience with actual cups, the way you reach for a cup. That's also your concept of a cup isn't some platonic ideal. It is the sum total of your interaction with sensory and motor experiences with actual cups. Okay, so basically they took an abstract, symbolic-like concept and wanted to push it out into sensory and motor systems and have sensory and motor experiences or representations be part of the high-level cognitive concept.
They're not just saying that you have this conception that was constructed via all these things, you're touching, you're feeling, blah, 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 they're saying that these sensory experiences are inseparable from your conception of the cup.
That's right. That they're part of it. They
Mm-hmm.
form. If you didn't have that, you would lose part of your concept. Basically, that is exactly right. That is, we don't need to abstract so much. All we do is kind of sum or do some operation over your sensory and motor representations.
There's something about this I think I like, but maybe you'll tell me that I'm misunderstanding what this is about, which is just that I do think, you know, as you know, the old-fashioned idea that there's cognition and there's affect, you know, has been replaced by the idea that they're pretty finely intertwined. And indeed, our perception of things tends to be colored by affect depending on our experience with them. You know, we feel differently when we look at food, to take an extreme case, than when we look at a brick. But there are even finer gradations in that. So I think you could say that feeling is part of perception, right, and part of your construction of the meaning of the thing.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong. I have no problem with the idea that you have a much more intertwined mental system. That's not a problem I have. I think the main problem with the approach is that it misunderstands the original conception of what cognitive science or cognitive psychology was trying to do. The main problem, so essentially what they're trying to do is they set up a traditional view in which you have input systems, and then you have the cognitive system in the middle that thinks about it and, you know, figures out what to do. And then you have the motor system on the other side that can act on it if the cognitive system decides such. And what these theorists are suggesting is that there isn't this sort of sandwich, as it's been called, this cognitive sandwich. It's really the cognitive part is spread out into the sensory and motor systems. Okay, so that's basically the claim, which I have absolutely no problem with. And it's true that there are some theories of conceptual representation that have those sorts of views, that there is an abstract and an input and an output and so on. The problem I have with it is the idea that this approach is going to replace cognitive psychology as a whole, that it is a theory of mind, when in fact it's not quite, because people who work in visual perception understand that visual perception involves a complicated set of computations that involve abstraction and all sorts of things. So it's not going to replace the kind of computational stuff that needs to happen in order to explain human vision.
So is part of it that you know, I think my idea, I had the idea that cognitive psychologists had come to think of perception as a process of construction. I mean, because for one thing, the data actually available to us on our eyes is a two-dimensional array of data, and the world is three-dimensional. So you've got to do some work to start conceiving of a three-dimensional world when your actual data is confined to two dimensions. So maybe that's a fairly elementary example of construction. But in general, the idea is that perception is construction and interpretation based on prior knowledge about what kinds of things there are in your environment and so on. So is that something that embodied cognition is kind of skeptical of, that there's that much construction?
There's variants of it. So the variant we've been talking about so far, basically, as far as I can tell, starts from the idea of high-level conceptual representations and wants to push them out into the sensory motor periphery in the brain, like we were saying. My response to that is that's fine, but basically it just pushes complexity into the sensory and motor systems. And you know, if that's where we want to have the high-level computational or abstraction happening, then that's fine. It's all in the brain. And it's true, you're right, that most perceptual scientists believe that that perception is a construction of the mind, that it isn't necessarily in the environment, all of it anyway, and so on. What some embodied theorists are doing is taking it a step further and saying not only are we going to push the high-level conceptual stuff from an abstract system into sensory motor systems, but we're going to push it even farther into the environment. Which is to say that our concepts are grounded in the physical environment. And in fact, the way we can think of perception is more of a resonance with the environment rather than a construction of the mind.
So they're saying construction isn't necessary in a sense.
In a very real sense. So that's getting closer to radical embodied cognition that denies computation, it denies...
So that's almost like what many psychologists would call kind of the naive layperson's conception of what perception is, right? The world is out there, and we just kind of soak it up.
That's right. That's right. It's basically some sort of a sensor that resonates with it, and then that generates some action or generates a response. It's a bit more like behaviorism in that sense, because what you have then is an environment that impinges on the organism. The organism is set up with certain sensors and arrayed in just the right way to allow appropriate responses to emerge from an interaction between the environment and the body.
Is there an ideology kind of associated with embodied cognition? The reason I ask is because I've heard people who are basically advancing certain kind of spiritual perspectives say that they grow out of embodied cognition. Embodied cognition isn't thought of as some kind of new age thing, is it? It's an actual theory by serious academics.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then the blog post of yours that I read took this radical embodied cognition, the idea that there's not much construction going on, it's more of a passive reception of what's out there in the environment. And you did something interesting with it. Why don't you talk about, I might expect somebody to pass judgment on that by doing some experiment, but you went into the realm of deep theoretical physics. What was your argument?
Yeah, so there's if you read back in a lot of my other blog posts, you'd see a lot of other more standard arguments against radical embodied cognition. Things like the existence of illusions. You can't explain illusions very easily if you're directly perceiving the environment. Direct perception is another buzzword that's often used, that you don't interpret anything, you perceive it directly. So that makes some pretty strong predictions, which is that the world better be exactly as we see it. That is, what we're seeing is in fact reality or a portion of reality. Of course, we don't see all of reality. We have visual access to the visible light portion of the spectrum and so on. We're not sensitive to everything that's out there. But what we are sensitive to better be real and veridical. It better be the truth about what the world is. Otherwise, what we're perceiving is just a grand illusion. So that's the prediction that
and that presumably would not have evolved. I mean, the mechanism would not have evolved by natural selection if it didn't do a good job of navigating us through the real world, right?
It wouldn't do a good job if it didn't navigate us through the real world, but there's nothing necessarily to guarantee that what we're seeing is a veridical representation of the real world. All natural selection needs to do is to make us adaptive.
Right.
So yeah,
like not bump into stuff.
Not bump into stuff. We'll basically just reproduce.
Right.
That's all we need to be able to do.
It has no preference for truth per se. If delusion helps us get our genes spread, then delusion will be built into our mind.
Delusion will win, yeah. And in fact, so if you do evolutionary games, simulations, genetic algorithms, and put a virtual organism, a population of organisms in a virtual world, and set it up such that you can pit veridicality of perception against fitness, and then do lots and lots of simulations, you can then ask the question, how often does a veridical representation of this virtual world evolve? And the answer in simulations that have been done so far is it never does. Fitness always wins, even if it misrepresents the world.
Right.
So that raises the possibility. I mean, it just kind of confirms what we knew from natural selection anyway. It doesn't care about what we see. It cares about reproducing. So that was an interesting result and raised the possibility that what we're seeing isn't necessarily veridical, that the world is completely a construction of our minds and doesn't, there's nothing to directly resonate with or directly perceive.
Mm-hmm.
That on its own I don't see as a very strong argument. It's an interesting possibility, but suppose we scaled up these simulations to be more realistic. You might say, well, if we did that, and then we ran the simulations, a system would evolve to see the truth because the truth is more fit for an organism and so on. That's a possibility. But physics is interesting, potentially, in this respect, because what we've been learning from physics for a very long time is that what we see isn't necessarily what's actually out there. We used to think the world was flat, turned out not to be the case. We used to think the the sun revolved around the Earth. Turned out not to be the case. We used to think that time was constant, that everything in the world had a definite state and place. We now know that time is relative, and we know that particles don't have a state until we measure them. And interestingly, in just the last year or two, I think it was, the kind of quantum weirdness that has been confirmed at the very small scales seems to hold at the visible scales as well. Very small, kind of molecular, not molecular, but molecule-sized objects. But in the visible realm also show quantum effects.
So which particular part of quantum weirdness are you talking about? The aforementioned fact that things seem not to exist in a definite state until we measure them?
Yeah, in general, just the idea that the world isn't like we perceive it. We perceive a bunch of static things that have a place and with a particular.
So just to review for people, the idea is that if you ask, well, where is this electron? There's not necessarily an actual answer until you measure it. Until you measure it, that what you have is a probability curve saying, well, there's X% chance that it's here, X% chance is here, and you can say it's nowhere, you can say it's everywhere, you can say whatever you want, but until you measure it, there is no answer to the question. And you're saying that has now been observed at higher levels of organization, like molecular levels?
Yes.
I didn't know that. That's pretty weird. That's an actual finding.
That's an actual finding. I can send you the report. I think it came out in 2012. I'm not a physicist, so the details of the experiment, I'm still trying to catch up on the physics side of things to fully understand them. But these effects hold at larger scales. So as perceptual scientists, as psychologists, we were never too worried about physics, because even though the world was really weird at the quantum level. So imagine if everyday objects, like the books behind you, were actually kind of quantum-like. That is, they didn't have a particular location or place in the world until you looked at them. That would really mess with our theories of how we perceive the world, because what you're perceiving isn't actually what's there.
Right.
What's actually there is some wave function or probability state, and we're perceiving things that are very definite. So if the quantum world scaled up, and in fact held of the world we inhabit in everyday life, that would completely blow every theory of perception out of the water. Include not only embodied cognition and direct perception kind of ideas, but everything. We would not be. We'd require a whole new theory. It would be an extremely radical revision to the way we think about how we perceive. So that's the question. So if physics. So that's why physics is relevant. So evolutionary game theory and genetic algorithms is telling us that organisms tend to evolve for fitness, not for truth. We can look at other organisms that, besides humans, that don't seem to see the truth at all. They see a very different world and get fooled by beer bottles for mating partners and things like that because they have the right shape and color. We humans think that we see the world veridically. But that may not be the case. And physics may give us the answer. If the physicists decide that space-time is not the right way to think about the true nature of our universe, then we've got a problem in terms of our psychological theories. And in fact, there are some physicists who are working at particle physics level who are saying that space-time is doomed. That in so many years, we're going to be rejecting the idea that space and time actually exist.
Yeah, I was actually talking to a physicist named Lee Smolin who said that you can, there are theories that you can state that for some purposes it's more efficiently to talk about networks than to talk about space-time. And that on a more fundamental level, with a network, all that matters is what's connected to what, rather than like what's adjacent to what, literally. And it was like, I didn't totally get it, but he's a really smart, respected guy, and that was an example where space itself would not be fundamental.
Right.
It would emerge from the theory, from a more elegant theory of physics.
Yeah, that's essentially the structure of the argument from the physics standpoint. That in order to really understand how particles scatter or whatever, we need to abandon the idea of space that, as we understand it, and go into some other description. And presumably that abandonment of space would apply not just at the quantum, at the very small level, but it would apply across the board. If space doesn't exist at the quantum level, then why would it exist at the level that we live? And so that changes the way you think about things, if true.
Yeah. Well, some physicists, by some readings, mainstream physics had already abandoned time, or at least viewed time as kind of more emergent from space, than less fundamental than space in
Right.
Einsteinian physics. But this would make time and space not the most fundamental things. So are you saying that this is a particular problem for radical embodied cognition, if the world out there is not the world out there? Because according to radical embodied cognition, perception is just the absorption of what's out there. You're saying, look, if nothing's out there, then you've got a problem with saying that all perception is the absorption of what's out there.
Yeah, it certainly is a major problem if there's no space-time, especially since the approach rejects the idea that the mind constructs reality, whereas a computational approach to the mind basically says that our experience is constructed by the mind. But the standard view within that constructionist approach is that it constructs a version of reality that's darn close to what's really there. So the fundamental idea that what our perception is as a computational construction could stay if physics tells us that there's no space-time. But it's going to have to change what the input to that system is. It is going to require a pretty radical rethinking of things.
So you might say, if the mainstream view now is that the mind is somewhat, constructionist, if there's no space-time, it is radically constructionist.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. Which is actually an interesting connection to physics, because the physicists have been worried about this so-called measurement problem. Why is it that something takes a definite position when we measure it? And why do we get to be so lucky to measure it? Why would physics care if we're measuring it?
Right.
But if you think of perception as a form of measurement, maybe what's happening when we look out at our books and cups and things is that we're measuring it and fixing it in space. And what it's actually doing when we're not looking at it is something very quantum-like.
Yeah, there are two different possible interpretations. One interpretation, and I think this is the mainstream one in physics, is that what brings the electron into definite shape is interaction with a macroscopic measuring device, which would happen, strictly speaking, even if we weren't looking. But then there's also the view that it's actually the looking. And there you're getting more deeply metaphysical in a way, because you're talking about kind of consciousness in some sense being more fundamental. It's called the ontological primacy of consciousness, the idea that consciousness is most fundamental stuff, and then what it sees is constructed by it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly where this leads, which is just turning everything on its head. It's interesting. It's either the most important development in the science of the mind, or it's just completely wrong in a very bad way. But it's interesting either way.
And it's weird.
It is weird.
The world is not getting less weird. Science is not making the world less weird.
No, it's not making it less weird. It may make it more elegant. But weird, it's going to be weird. Especially, if we're built simply to reproduce, and somehow we're getting hints through science as to what's behind the curtain. It's a very interesting thing.
It is very interesting. The other prospect that emerges, there's been some flirtation with the idea that we're actually living in a simulation, and there's actually some giant hacker out, computer. This is in a way kind of consistent with the idea with that. If you imagine a creature in an actual video game, then the space-time they're moving in is actually a construction, and more fundamentally, there's a circuit board, there's a network.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. It's similar to that idea, but this has potential scientific legitimacy. You can, if for example, you can somehow tie in psychological theories with physical theories and derive certain physical properties from the psychological theories you developed, show connections, then you can, reasonably justify that you've made some scientific progress. So you just apply the same logic and mathematical techniques that physicists are applying to understand things that we can't see, can only see shadows of, essentially, to theories of perception and theories of the mind, and you just proceed in that way.
Are there many people working this space that you worked in this one blog post doing this kind of speculative? No.
Not a lot. My colleague Don Hoffman here in my department is someone who's worked a lot on this, and I'm peripherally involved, and it's a fascinating thing, and so I'm interested. I can't help but be interested.
It's very interesting.
It's worth exploring. So yeah, but there's not a lot. It's such a crazy idea. One of the implications for that is that the objects that we see in the world have no causal effects. If they're a construction of our mind, what's causing, things when they bump into each other, is not the objects we see. It's something else. And our measurements of the brain, which we think are causally related to behavior, are also in this constructed world. So that means that neurons and brain networks also have no causal power in controlling behavior, which makes neuroscience hard to do.
Yeah. Well, the idea goes back to David Hume that we actually cannot confidently infer actual causality from the fact that certain things tend to precede other things reliably. Right. So that's an old idea. Well, okay, this has gotten weird enough for me. I think I'll check out. We should remind people that to get back to a more concrete subject, the name of your book is The Myth of Mirror Neurons.
Yes.
And so far, by your own account at least, you are carrying the day in this argument.
That's what I'd like to think.
Yeah, well, don't we all? But it sounds like you're probably right. Well, congratulations on that. And thanks a lot, Greg.
Thank you, Bob. It's been great talking to you.
Same here.